Ducks fans, are you ready? You are listening to the Ducks and Pucks podcast with your hosts, Mike Walters and Eddie Jones. This is the number one home for Anaheim Ducks talk and analysis. Here we go.
Welcome to the show. This is your host, Mike Walters, along with my co-host, Eddie Jones, and we're going to wrap up the season for the Ducks, unfortunately. Not really what we expected, Eddie. The Ducks went down in 4 games to San Jose. We predicted maybe the Ducks would pull it off in 6 or 7, but alas, here we are. The season's over, so we're going to kind of talk about, kind of what, a little recap of the season, how it kind of went. It was kind of a crazy ride. We'll talk about, obviously, the playoff series and the disappointment there. Then plenty to talk about with the exit interviews that came up this last week. And we'll discuss a little bit about, what the Ducks do, in the future with free agency and the draft. So, Eddie, not really where we wanted to be. I don't want to be depressed. I mean, this is it. The season's over. So, all I can really say about this year, I guess, as opposed to the other seasons, is it started off crazy with, Kessler and Lindholm and Vatanen out. Getzlaf was in and out. And then, of course, Eves ended up going out for a while. So I'd say the beginning of the season was really, low expectations. I mean, so many people out, so many things going on. The Ducks, they hung around basically in the beginning half of the season. And, I mean, that's kind of, how I remember this year. And then, of course, they turned it on late. And then again, didn't make it in the playoffs. But what do you think about the season as far as, how it started and ended and everything?
Yeah, because, we were so upset, I think, in the beginning half of the season. And there was a lot of pessimism that people thought that the Ducks weren't going to make the playoffs. And I think we were among that group at one point where we said, multiple times we said if the Ducks don't win these next few games, they're pretty much out. They're so far behind. They weren't playing well at the time. The injuries were playing a huge role in that, and it just didn't really seem like they were going to come back. And then all of a sudden, everybody does come back healthy. John Gibson continues playing great, and this team just went on a roll, and they were able to grind their way back into second in the Pacific Division, and everything looked great. It was like a complete flip of the script. Went from disappointing to great. The Ducks were able to claw their way back again into a playoff spot, getting into home ice advantage in the first round. Everything looked amazing. A lot of people were thinking that the Ducks could be sleepers in the playoffs, that they were going to make a long run if everybody continued to play at the same level. And it went right back to being disappointing again when the playoffs started, because the Ducks' offense disappeared. Defense was just a mess without Cam Fowler, and goaltending got hung out to dry in a playoff series where the Ducks got swept pretty handily by the San Jose Sharks. And the only real competitive game they played was Game 4, and they still couldn't finish in that game, and they only scored the 1 goal. Of course, a couple of them got disallowed, rightly so, but it's disappointing to see that. And the Ducks ended up getting swept, and nobody expected it. So now here we are sitting at the end of the season, disappointed again. I mean, there were some great moments this year, and those kind of get lost, I think, after this disappointing exit from the postseason. Nobody expected the Ducks and Sharks series to end at 4 games. I had picked Ducks in 7. I think you had picked Ducks in 6. When I was on the Teal Tinted Glasses podcast, they had picked the Sharks in 6. One of them had picked the Sharks in 7. So even Sharks fans believed that this was going to be a long series. And it ends up, surprising everybody. And, of course, Ducks fans aren't happy with how the outcome was. And that kind of spilled over into a lot of the Carlisle out chants and a lot of things in regards to Bob Murray as well, and Ryan Getzlaf, Corey Perry. I mean, this always happens when the Ducks lose, especially when they lose in a disappointing fashion like this, but it's crazy the roller coaster type season we had, where it started so low, went up near the end of the season, and in the playoffs it's right back down to where we started.
Yeah, and before we get into all the, I guess, the post-season craziness, obviously you see the hashtag Carlisle out, fire Carlisle, fire Murray. They're all over there. I mean, if you haven't seen them, then you check out Twitter. They're all over the place. But as far as the season and like some of the stuff that happened, I mean, there were some good things. Obviously getting Henrique was good. He scored 20 goals with the Ducks this year, 36 points. We saw him on the third line. Casse, he ended up getting 20 goals as well. The Ducks had some good scoring going for the top 3 lines, which we'll talk about, a little bit more in depth about that too, with the exit interviews and whatnot in the future, how the Ducks need to kind of improve, being a four line team. But as far as those three lines, they came in and they did the scoring. If the top one and two weren't giving any, so that part was good. You also had the Hockey Hall of Fame with Korea and Solani. You got to see that during the season, even though that doesn't really affect, the way that the outcome went. But that was another, at least a positive thing you could see. Goaltending was great between Gibson and Miller. And, for the people that dislike Carlisle and want him out and all that, we'll talk about that, like I said, in a little bit. But if you look at the season too, Eddie, he did keep the team together during the season. So I know. Yeah. A lot of people are mad, and don't get me wrong, I'm not happy either about the way it ended, and we'll go into that too. But as far as you look at Carlisle, the team in the first half with all those injuries, we knew the Ducks weren't going to be in a playoff spot in the beginning, but they hung around. Carlisle kept them there. Then, like you said, everybody got healthy minus Eves, and Carlisle pushed them, and they got all the way into second. So, there was some good stuff during the season. I think it's just it's not just that it ended, Eddie. I just think it's the way that it ended. Like you said, Sharks fans alike thought it was going to go 6 or 7 games, and then the abrupt ending, I think that's what was disappointing. But, if you look at the season on a whole and you look at all the stuff that went on, the Ducks still had a pretty decent season. Yeah, they didn't end up in first in the Pacific. I know you and I hammered that home that we don't care, which we still don't care. They ended up in second. But, that's just, I think, what it's kind of left a sour taste in everybody's mouth is just the abrupt finish to the playoffs for the Ducks.
Yeah, I think so. And I gotta get to the comment because I'm sure everybody listening has lit a fire under that comment and how Randy Carlisle got the Ducks back into it when everybody came back healthy. I think that to some extent is true. But the thing I always look for, when you look at the way the players played and everything, you can kind of credit that a bit to the system that the Ducks have in place, I guess, to the Ducks being successful. For me, what I look at is the one thing that, as a coach, you really can't have an impact on, and that's goaltending. There's not much he can do for setting up a system. Maybe obviously putting some better defense in front of John Gibson would help, but if you look at what the Ducks would have done with just even above average goaltending, they would have been a team in the bottom 10, if not close to the bottom 5 in their point pace for the entire season. They would have been a lottery team without the play of John Gibson this year. It's just unbelievable. And again, we talk about Randy Carlisle getting the benefit of the doubt from the injuries. He's also getting bailed out heavily, as pretty much as everybody is, by John Gibson and to some extent Ryan Miller as well. Because without those two, and obviously without John Gibson, this is a team that easily misses the playoffs. Because, when you look at when everybody was out, John Gibson was the guy helping win these tight games. He was running the ship. And, of course, bringing in Adam Henrique helped and having everybody back healthy when they were getting that third line scoring when the first line was slumping. And then when that line disappeared, you had the first line going at times. And then eventually, Kessler, Cogliano, and Silfverberg kicked it into gear. But the real steady thing that was always consistent all year was John Gibson. And really, in my opinion, that's the only reason the Ducks season looks somewhat salvageable. And you can maybe... that's why some people are putting a positive spin on Randy Carlisle and what he was able to do for this team. In my opinion, he did nothing, and it was all John Gibson. Because without him, this team, like I already said, is a team that would have easily missed the playoffs. And then we're looking at maybe a no doubter and Randy Carlisle getting fired, because if they had have finished where they would have been projected to finish with average goaltending, I don't think there's any way he would have stuck around. If this is a lottery team. Do you see any way that Carlisle would have been back this year? I don't. I don't see how it would have been possible with all the expectations that were put on this team, even despite the injuries.
Yeah, you look at exactly what you're talking about, and I think you just go back to Murray's quote. I don't remember the exact wording, but it was something about goaltending, covers up a lot of crap or something like that, to that effect he was talking about. And
he said good goaltending tends to cover up a lot of crap.
Yeah, okay, so it was what it was. I couldn't quite remember. I wasn't sure. But I that's what I thought too. I agree with you. When, the people out there that are saying, oh, keep Carlisle, I I have mixed feelings. I feel as you do. I think he did keep the team together in the beginning of the season when all the injuries and all that. But as
Yeah.
far as the season as a whole, I agree with you. I think the Ducks leaned on Gibson super heavily. They leaned on Miller at times too, especially also down the stretch too, as we saw at the end of the season. So I definitely think that the goaltending bailed him out, and I think that's the big issue. We can kind of talk about those exit interviews and all the news that came out of that day. The big news out of that that everybody went crazy on was that Carlisle was coming back, and I agree with you. I think if for some reason if Gibson was gone or Gibson had a bad year or he was hurt or whatever, and the goaltending wasn't there for whatever the reason was, I agree with you. I think if the Ducks finished down in the bottom of the Pacific, they didn't make it, they weren't close, I don't think you bring him back, and I still don't think you bring him back. I think the biggest thing, and I know some fans out there have talked about this, you and I have talked about this, is one thing with Murray that's kind of annoying is that when something goes wrong or something doesn't go right, he doesn't like to admit that he went with a bad choice. So I think part of it, Eddie, is he doesn't want to get rid of Carlisle because then it makes him look bad. So he turns around and gets rid of Trent Yanni, which we just heard that news too, which I kind of wasn't surprised. Although actually, let me rephrase that. They didn't get rid of Trent Yanni. They just didn't bring him back. Yeah. He wasn't fired. Let me clarify that. But I think that was kind of one of the subtle moves. But I mean, don't you kind of feel that way too, Eddie? That like maybe with Murray, it's I don't want to be wrong, but I'm going to try and make some other adjustments. And there's other comments we'll get to as well.
Yeah, I think so, because if he does fire Carlisle, that doesn't look great on him, because you went from having having Randy Carlisle, firing and bringing in Bruce Boudreau, and then firing him and bringing back Randy Carlisle, and then if you fire Randy Carlisle, a couple seasons after hiring him again, that does not look great on you. I mean, it doesn't look great on him right now, keeping him either way. He looks bad no matter what, but I think he looks a lot worse firing Randy Carlisle. The fans would love it, but on his image and his ability to find the right guy and hire the right coach, it doesn't look great on him, because what he said, he's made comments in both the articles that I've read and from Mike Coppinger and Eric Stevens that he has a lot of confidence in Randy Carlisle and what he can do next season. But then you hear things like, he wants to completely change the style of his team. He wants to have a faster team. He was disappointed at the fact that the fourth line only played about 5 to 7 minutes. He thinks they should play 10 to 14 minutes. And these are all true things. But, if you're sitting here saying you have confidence in your coach, and then you say those things along with the quote that we'd already mentioned, saying good goaltending tends to cover up a lot of crap, how can you say you have confidence in your coach when you're also saying these things and basically nitpicking at different things that were wrong with his system? They are true, but how do you have confidence then if you find all these holes and what your coach is doing? That's what amazes me. And again, that's where I think it backs up your point a bit, that as a GM, you never want to admit you're wrong, whether it's with us hiring a coach, getting a player, drafting a certain guy. I think that's one of the reasons Nick Ritchie is maybe still around, because they don't want to admit they messed up on that pick, which is understandable. We see that across the league, teams love to hold on to these guys, just hoping and hoping and hoping that they're eventually going to get back to what that you expected them. Yeah, Nail Yakupov is a perfect example in Edmonton. They held on to him forever, just hoping that he was going to get somewhat close to what they expected when they drafted him first overall, and eventually they just felt it was time to move on. And they had to admit their mistakes. They had to admit that they're wrong. That was a weak draft, but there was other players available. Alex Galchenyuk was one of them that you could have drafted over him at the time, and it would have worked out better for the Oilers. So, yeah, I think there's some instance to that, but it's just the comments are just so interesting to me, because some of them are just ridiculous, and then the others, like I said, they just contradict each other.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest problem for everybody out there, is looking at improving this team. Some of those comments, he's saying that the team needs to be faster. They got to play a more speed game. Perry's got to be quicker. But honestly, I mean, I don't really know how they're going to do a lot of changes, Eddie, because you have the same coach. You have the big three tied up in their contracts. We will talk a little bit about, the offseason, who they got to bring back. We'll run some numbers and whatnot. But other than really shuffling the lineup, I mean, there's not a lot to do. I mean, and we talked about the lineup a little bit throughout the season. of course, the good news from the exit interviews is that Patrick Eaves. Well, I guess the little bad news was he was coming back, and then he had some shoulder issues. He had to have surgery. But the good news is it sounds like he's going to be back in October, either at the beginning of the season or shortly thereafter. So that's the good news. So taking that part of it and him coming back, I think the way that you can adjust the speed game is you put Eaves on the top line. You put him with Getzlaf and Raquel. That'll make it a little bit faster on that line. If you keep the Kessler line together, then maybe you have Casse, Henrique, and Perry on the third line, and then you bump Richie down to the fourth line. I mean, maybe that's a way that you can do something with the personnel as it is right now. And we can get into trades and things in the free agency towards the end of the show. But as far as what the Ducks have right now, if they're not going to do any moves, there's really not a lot of options, Eddie, for the Ducks to change this lineup. I mean, Perry can't just get faster. I mean, that's not really his game. His game is to get in front of the net, get under the skin of the opposing goalie and the defenseman, and do all that kind of stuff. And then, I mean, it just blows my mind, those comments. And the same thing with Carlisle is, well, you have faith in Carlisle, and then you want this team to be more speed, and you also want to play a fourth line, but the Ducks don't play a fourth line. We've known this for years. They play the top nine, which is a problem. You look at these playoff teams, and why do they do well? They roll four lines. And it doesn't mean the fourth line is a great line, but it's something that you had talked about, is that you have a 3A and a 3B kind of situation with a lot of these playoff teams. And the Ducks don't do that. And so where do they go? I mean, you keep the same coach. You don't have a lot of personnel that you can change. Like I said, well, there's some options we'll get to a little bit later in the show, but I mean, I'm with you. It's bizarre to me, his comments. You're trying to put a square peg in a round hole. I just don't know how it's going to work.
Yeah, I mean, those comments about Perry are just plain ridiculous, saying he's got to buy into playing fast. We have a few more than him that have to buy into playing fast. I mean, it just doesn't happen. I mean, you can have a fast system which can make players, in theory, it can make players faster because you're playing a faster style of hockey, but it's not going to make them faster, and it's not going to make this team faster because they don't have the personnel. I think they have some players who could fit a system like that. Ryan Getzlaf can pretty much fit in any system, and then you've got some quicker players who can move the puck up in Rickard Raquel, Andre Kasha, Jakob Silfverberg, Andrew Cogliano, Adam Henrique, all those types of guys. I think they could fit a system like that. Like you said, the square pegs and round holes type of guys are Corey Perry and Nick Ritchie, guys that are big, heavier guys that might not necessarily fit that system, but I feel like, every team kind of has those guys, and if you're playing a faster system, you've got enough players who fit that system, you can carry those guys along and it doesn't get noticed as much. But I just don't see how they're going to change. I mean, honestly, it doesn't, if you've got the same coach in here, I don't understand how all of a sudden he's going to have the ability to put in a fast system in place and change the way this team is going to play, especially, like you said, if you're not going to go out and really change much. There isn't much they can do. The top nine is pretty much set. You've got Patrick Eaves, who's going to be an addition to this lineup. He doesn't make the team faster, but you've got him who's going to come into the lineup. He's going to jump right up into the top six, you would assume, probably playing with Ryan Getzlaf and Rickard Raquel. The Kessler line doesn't seem like it's ever going to get broken up, which you would have them together. And then Corey Perry probably slots down with Adam Henrique and Andre Kasha. And then you have a fourth line that constitutes of something around Nick Ritchie, Derek Grant, JT Brown if he comes back, those types of guys down there. And maybe you see some of the kids come up, depending on how often that fourth line plays. If you got Max Jones, Sam Steele, and Troy Terry all eligible to play for San Diego next year, I don't know. I honestly don't know. And again, some of the comments he also had, like saying, are Logan Couture and Pavelski really fast skaters? No. They're good hockey players, but if your team plays fast, you can make players faster. To some extent, that's true, but that usually happens. You make a team faster by going out and getting a different coach who can bring a different perspective in here and has a style that is generally just a faster style. And I don't see how Carlisle's going to do that. I mean, if he had that in his arsenal, would you not pull that out in a game 4 when you're down 3-0 in a series against a team that has shown they are faster than you and they play a style that has completely dominated the style that the Ducks put into place? That would be the time to pull that out and show that you have that in your arsenal, and he didn't, which makes me believe that he doesn't have the ability to do that. So I honestly just don't know how things are going to change. And we've heard from him before saying he thinks he sometimes can go out and just get fast players. Carl Hagelin was an example of just getting a fast player and hoping you can just be a fast team, and it didn't work out for the Ducks. He didn't have a good time in Anaheim. He ends up getting traded to Pittsburgh for David Perron. David Perron had a great time when he was with the Ducks, but then Carl Hagelin goes in and fits well in a fast system in the Penguins and ends up winning a Stanley Cup. So I don't know. And then his comments from Mike Coppinger's article where he says the plan doesn't necessarily involve acquiring quicker players, saying that Murray pointed to the attacking style the Sharks used and says that he would like to see the Ducks skate in a similar fashion. It's all nice to sit here and say that you want to see them do that, but I don't know how they're going to do that when you still have the head coach behind the bench and all you did was let go the assistant coach in charge of defense and penalty kill. That could change some things for sure, but it's not gonna completely change the way this team plays.
Yeah, and I think that's where everybody's concerned. And going back to that Sharks series, because you touched on it a little bit, the two things that irritated me most, I know a lot of people saw it because I know we posted it on the DucksNPucks Twitter, was the whole thing about the lineup the last day. You're right. He went the same lineup in Game 3. They played a much better game in Game 4, but he didn't really make a whole lot of changes on anything. He, like you said, he didn't like go, okay, maybe I'll throw in Terry in this game, get another speed guy in there, or maybe I'll switch some people around or something. He didn't do much. They played a lot better than that 8-1 shellacking that they had, but there was no adjustments at all. Until the third period when he started to mix some of the lines up a little bit. But I think that's the concern. We you and I talked about that before, about like the in-game changes that Carlisle doesn't do a lot of that. And obviously there were some unfortunate breaks in Game 4. Getzlaf's one goal was basically like a tenth of a second too late. The stupid offsides where unfortunately didn't bring the puck across the blue line. Maybe the Ducks force overtime, win that game, whatever. But there just didn't seem like any desire to try to do anything to make the team faster in Game 4. Like you said, when that's the chance, you could have gone for broke. You could have put in somebody. You could have started the game with different line and all that we talked about. None of that happened. So that part frustrated me. And then, of course, the other part is about going out and getting players. And you and I talked about this. Murray does very well at the draft. When it comes to trade deadlines, like whatever. And the thing that it came back and it did hurt the Ducks was Evander Kane. Especially in a couple of the early games. And you and I said this. We said, okay, we were happy that he didn't sell the farm to go and get certain players. Obviously, we didn't want to mortgage the future and that whole rhetoric that we talked about. But if you know that these other teams like the Kings and the Sharks are going out to get these certain players, you got to do something. And instead, they don't go get Kane. And, he literally comes back to bite you in the playoffs. And that's the thing that's, I think, worrisome going forward, too, is like, well, are the Ducks going to go out and get big players? And we'll talk about the numbers and stuff in a little bit. And there's a lot of fan questions, of course, concerned about the contracts of the big three, which we can go into in just a second here. But I think that's the worry, Eddie, is that you're not going to be able to go out and get a big name player. And what kind of adjustments are you going to do in the lineup other than bringing up the young guys from San Diego or some of the other minor leagues?
Yeah, and I think there's no question that this lineup is a skilled lineup. They've got the talent up and down the lineup. When they're fully healthy, you've got a very good top nine that can compete with some of the best in the National Hockey League. You got some great center depth in Getzlaf, Kessler, and Henrique, and hopefully Kessler is a lot healthier at the beginning of next year than he was at the end of this year. And you've got a very good top four on your blue line in Lindholm, Manson, and Fowler and Montour, and then obviously a Vezina caliber goaltender in John Gibson and a very good backup in Ryan Miller. So you've got good players, and you've got a good team here, and that can get you by in a lot of things and kind of mask a lot of things, just as Murray said that goaltending covers up a lot of crap. Well, this is still a good team. This is a team, even if you don't change the style and you go in with the lineup, and if everybody does stay relatively healthy throughout the rest of the season, they probably still make the playoffs and do pretty well. But again, you're going to lose games where on paper you are a more skilled team, but you're going to lose games because you're playing a style that's just outdated in the National Hockey League. You're going to get outskated by a lot of teams, and they might not necessarily be more skilled than you. You're just playing a style that really doesn't work anymore, and it doesn't help the Ducks offensively. As we saw that they were near the bottom half of the league, or near the bottom third of the league in goal scoring this year because they couldn't get anything going. They were getting outskated on a regular basis by a lot of teams. And we saw on occasion, we always talked about a big talking point was how the Ducks played down to a lot of teams this year. they were more skilled than those teams, but the system they play, they got outskated, they got outworked, and they couldn't get any chances going. I mean, the one that always comes back to me is because it was such a disappointing game and a boring game to watch was the game against Detroit. I think it was the first game they had gone and played at Little Caesars Arena, where most of the guys were back healthy. The Ducks ended up losing that game, I think 2-1. They couldn't get anything going. The goaltending for Detroit wasn't great that game. The Ducks just couldn't get any quality chances, and there was multiple times we saw that through games 1, 2, 3, and even 4 in the playoffs against San Jose. They couldn't get anything going. They scored 4 goals in that series. I mean, they have enough talent in their lineup to play well offensively, and again, that also creeps into the power play a bit as well, because we've wondered for years now, since the Ducks had the top-rated power play when Paul McLean was here, why can't this team figure things out? They've got guys like Ryan Getzlaf, Corey Perry, Rickard Rakell, Fowler, Montour, all these types of guys, Adam Henrique, on their first and second unit on the power play, but they routinely finish near the bottom third of the league. So it comes down to the system you're playing. If they can find a system that works and they can play faster and they can start competing with these teams, this is going to be a scary team for a couple of seasons. But keeping Randy Carlyle around, I just don't see it happening. And again, like you said, there's not a lot of room to add guys into the lineup because you've got these contracts that you're kind of stuck in, and you've got a top 9 that's pretty much set. Maybe you can go out and add a fourth line forward. I still think they do need to bring in somebody to play on that bottom pairing, defense pairing. I don't think bringing up the kids and just hoping they work is the best idea because it didn't work this year. I don't think it's going to be the best bet to go to at the beginning of next season. So it's tough, and I mean, you have some kids in the system that maybe you can promote, and maybe the only other thing you can do is to look at some trades. But if you do go out and try and get a Max Pacioretty or any of the big names available that are going to be up and open for trade at the draft, you're going to have to give up a roster player in return, whether it be Andre Cash or Jakob Silfverberg or anybody, Nick Ritchie or anything like that. You're going to have to give up a guy that's currently in your top 9 to get a guy that can fit in there. So I don't know. It's going to be an interesting offseason. I don't think there's going to be big things that happens for the Ducks, but there's a lot of different avenues they can go to change the way this team's going to look.
Yeah, and I mean, with that, give just a couple quick updates, and then we'll kind of get into the fan questions because it ties into the whole thing you're talking about. As far as we'll look at, the cap and the players that are coming and going, and obviously a lot of people have concerns and questions that we'll get to. So the things that we do know with the team, Ed, is we do know that Ryan Kessler is getting better. On the exit interview day, he said he lost 20 pounds. He plans to stay at that lower weight. He should be good to go for next season. So there's the positive there. We also know that Adam Henrique, he wants to stay even longer than next season. So there's talks about that, and we'll go into how that factors in with the monetary stuff. Cam Fowler looks like he's going to be good to go next year too. The kind of the reoccurring theme is it looks like the team is not going to have, other than Eves having that one surgery, there's going to be no major surgeries in the offseason that we know of. And as far as Bieksa, he's the one that looks like he's going to be out. So he's going to be gone. I know a lot of people are clapping and excited about that. I mean, the big thing I for me, I mean, it's a game, and obviously, everyone has their careers and stuff. I don't dislike the guy. I don't like the price tag. That's my biggest thing. So I think that's the part that helps. So with some of those updates and what's going on, we look at the team and we look at the salary cap. Eddie and I looked at it before the show, trying to do some math here, and obviously, looking at cap friendly and whatnot. So I forgot to mention also, Francois is obviously not coming back too. It was his last season. I mean, unless he changes his mind. But so you've got Bieksa and Boschman out. That's $5 million coming off the cap, and then the decision, I think, which Eddie and I kind of harped on, is about this fourth line and what the Ducks are going to do. Well, you've got Vermette, Kelly, Brown, and Chimera all to look at. You have a little over $5 million there if you don't bring them back. So you have close to $10 million that could be, 10, 11 million that could be added. Obviously, there's a little bit of that's going to get cut because Fowler's getting a $2.5 million raise and Manson's getting a little over $3 million raise. So all that math and all that stuff put together, if your brain's not fried yet, it's going to be probably, between 8 and 9 million that the Ducks are going to have to look at. And it's tough, Eddie, because some of these fan questions that we had, some of them on, Twitter is, Kyle asked, well, what about the big three? Obviously, he's talking about Perry, Getzlaf, and Kessler. What do you do? Someone else said, well, are they going to buy out Perry? There was a couple concerns about that. David asked, does he get moved in any type way on Facebook? So kind of tie all those together, some of those questions. But that's what kind of hinders this whole situation too, Eddie, is you've got those three guys. I really doubt Perry gets traded. Obviously, he has no movement clause, just like Getzlaf and Kessler do. Can you go the buyout route? Yeah, you could try and go the buyout route, but I mean, Perry wasn't great, but he wasn't that bad. And I think that's the problem I see is, I mean, he had 17 goals. I know it's not 25, it's not 30, it's not 40. I know the expectation's not there of where they weren't met at least, and he didn't play a consistent game. We saw him some games going in towards the goalie and getting irritated and doing all that, but other times he didn't. So I think the issue here is you have 8 to 9 million to play with this summer, which is not a lot. And then you've got some RFAs you got to look at. Obviously, Richie and Casse, you want to bring those guys back. Hello, Brandon Montour, of course. So it's a tough spot that the Ducks are in with, how to improve this team with the type of funds and then obviously the big contracts that are tied up, Eddie. There's not a whole lot that the Ducks can do, unfortunately, other than trading, draft picks and things like that when, obviously the draft comes up.
Yeah, for the buyout and the way it would work if you bought out Corey Perry, how his cap hit would be distributed throughout the remaining 6 years of his contract, it's just not worth it. I mean, they bought him out, say, at the end in the offseason right now, you'd have just over $4 million buyout cap hit for this season coming up, which would eat up, then you've only got about $5 million to work with after you buy him out. You're moving out a 50-point guy off your roster. He's still going to take $4 million of your cap hit. And now you've only got $5 million to work with to try to replace that and then add more to your team. Then the next season after that, it's about $2.5 million. Then for the third season, and this is where it's a big issue for the Ducks, because the third season, which is 2020-2021, after that his cap hit for that year of his buyout is $6.68 million.
Ouch.
That's a lot. But the problem is, you're looking at having to re-sign the season before that, Adam Henrique possibly, Jakob Silfverberg, and the big one is John Gibson.
Yep.
He's going to get a raise. If you want to bring Jakob Silfverberg back, you would assume he probably gets a little bit more than he's making right now. Adam Henrique possibly gets around the same, if not a little bit more, depending if he can re-sign or not. But you've got a guy who's not even playing on your roster, who you're paying that season $6.6 million, who is preventing you from maybe re-signing one of those guys. And then from there on, it's only just over $2 million for the last 3 seasons of his contract. But I don't understand. I mean, what's the point, really, right? If you're doing that, you're going to buy him out to have basically his cap hit still hurt this team, when you could have him on the roster. And yeah, it sucks you're paying him, $8.6 million, but at least he's still putting up 50 points on your team, and you're paying him money to do that. I mean, it would make no sense to buy him out and still pay such a hefty price for him to put up points against you, essentially, on a different team. So for Corey Perry, I don't see him getting bought out. Maybe he gets traded, but again, I already mentioned this before on this show. If he gets traded, it essentially kicks off a rebuild for the Ducks. I mean, you're not going to get anything significant in return, I don't think, for Corey Perry. We saw some reports saying there would be considerable interest if Ryan Getzlaf or Corey Perry were available for trade, but I don't think the assets that you're going to get back are going to be anything that helps this team immediately. It'd be signaling a rebuild, and you'd be looking at guys like Ryan Kessler and Ryan Getzlaf as guys who'd be potential to move out the door right after Corey Perry. So I don't think that's the best direction for the Ducks. I don't see it happening, but even with him still on the team, like you said, you've got about $8 or $9 million to work with. It's enough to go out and add some pieces to make this team. It gives you some freedom, I guess, to make a trade and maybe acquire a guy with a bigger cap hit. But again, you have to take into consideration, of course, Adam Henrique and Jakob Silfverberg, and having to sign them at the end of 2 seasons from now. But the big one for me, again, is John Gibson. He's only making $2.3 million right now. You can bet there's going to be a significant raise on that when his contract is up. So you got to take that into consideration. Any deal I feel like the Ducks sign, if they go out and get a free agent, or they go out and trade for somebody, it's going to be a guy that only has about a year or two left on his contract, so that it ends around the same time they have to re-sign John Gibson. Any guy they bring in or sign, that contract shouldn't go over that period and move into the next year where it does interfere with how much money you have left to sign John Gibson, because that could be a huge issue for them. Yes, John Gibson's an RFA, so that gives you a little bit of freedom there to maybe move out a guy you have that time, but you don't want to have to be doing that last minute and hoping that you can get that done, in the same offseason where you're hoping to get him signed.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a huge part when you're looking at, if you go on Cap Friendly and you look at the Ducks lineup here and you look at the contracts and what's going on, you got to look ahead. I mean, obviously, you look at Richie and Kase coming up. You look at Montour. That's all stuff that's got to be addressed now. But like you said, Gibson's right there on the horizon. And then, we've had some fan questions too that they're asking about. We have Chase. He asks about Henrique, Silverberg, and Gibson, and can the Ducks get all three basically? And he also talks about, as I mentioned, Montour and Richie and whatnot. So he asked a couple of those questions on Twitter. I think that the Ducks can keep all three of those guys. I really do, but like you said, if they're going to bring in anybody else, it's got to be something short term, something that's not going to cost too much money. And I think that's where the Ducks are kind of stuck right now. The only thing, I know you and I talked about this, is if the Ducks do want to try and get faster and someone you can move out, it's not going to move a lot of money, but someone you could try and move is Nick Ritchie. I mean, if you look at this stuff, a lot of people are taking aim at Corey Perry, and I totally get it. I mean, he's not performed to where he's been. But the problem is the math does not support a buyout of Corey Perry. And then, like you said, you're going to pay him $4 million 1 year, and then $6 million the last year. He's going to be on another team scoring goals against you because he's going to get picked up if you buy him out. I mean, come on, somebody's going to pick him up. Maybe he will not at an $8 million price tag, but he wouldn't need it. He's already getting 4. He could go to another team and take 2 or 3, and then come back and bite us. So I highly doubt that happens. Trade, I don't see that either. So to me, you got to look at other players, and one of them I look at is Richie. I mean, if you want this team to get faster, if Eves comes back, like you and I talked about, goes with Getzlaf and Raquel because they have pretty good chemistry. Perry goes to the third line. That leaves Richie on the fourth line. So, I mean, and then there's still interest out there in Richie. I mean, he didn't have a terrible season. He had 10 goals, but again, he's not meeting the expectations. We thought, he could be, 20, 30 goal scorer, but he's clearly not. That's one guy. Maybe the Ducks move out. I mean, there's not a whole lot of other room as far as, players getting traded and whatnot. You have some of the ones coming off, like we said, obviously BX's big contract, but that's one name that I would really keep an eye on, because unless they were able to trade Perry for some reason, which I still doubt, I don't see a whole lot of movement trade-wise, at least for rostered players, Eddie.
Yeah, and to hit on the first part of the question and talking about if they can re-sign Gibson, Silfverberg, and Adam Henrique, I think a lot of that just depends on what they do this season, in the offseason, and next year, because there's not a lot of money coming off. Really, there's almost nothing at all other than this season. The next time you see money come off is when we do have to re-sign Adam Henrique and Jakob Silfverberg, because you've got all these guys up at the end of this year, and Antoine Vermette, Chris Kelly, JT Brown, Jason Chimera, Nick Ritchie, Andre Castor, Derek Grant, and then the guys you mentioned on defense, BX Boschman, Montour, and Walensky. The only money you see come up off the books later is you see Red Alberta's $700K come off, Corbinian Holzer's $900K comes off. You've got to re-sign Marcus Pettersson at the same time there. Not like he's going to command a lot, but that's it. I mean, other than that, you've got the same money on the board, and you've got whoever you sign this season or trade for, if there is anybody, if it's a longer-term deal. And then you've got that $8 or $9 million to work with, like I said. And if any of these guys are going to get raises, and you would assume John Gibson is going to get a raise, I would have to look at comparable goaltenders to see what they're making. But I would assume it would have to be around at least $6 million if he continues to play the way he's playing right now, if not more. And that's a huge chunk of what you have left. That's about a $4 million raise on what he's making. He does deserve it. But without any money coming off the books, unless you try and dump some salary here or there and trade some guys, where's that freedom going to come from? I think realistically, when they get to that point, they might only be able to sign 2 of these guys, and we might see a trade involving one of Jakob Silfverberg, Adam Henrique down the road if they don't think they can sign them. You know, a deadline type deal, depending on how the Ducks are doing, or you move them earlier on, like we saw with Sammy Vatanen in the regular season, and try and get some piece back that at least either helps you in the long term or is a little bit of a longer term deal, so that you have that guy on the books for longer and it doesn't hurt your ability to sign the other two. That's what I could see. But other than that, I mean, you're talking about maybe seeing who could be out the door in a trade, other than, you know, possible surprises in Jakob Silfverberg and Andre Kasha if you're trying to package them in a different deal. Nick Ritchie, I feel like, is the most logical option, because if you had to pick a guy who wouldn't fit in a faster style, I feel like the easy go-to option is Nick Ritchie. And, you know, if you're going to bump him down to the fourth line, that's not going to necessarily help him. If you still believe in the fact that he is a guy that could eventually get close to that potential we had pegged him as when they drafted him 10th overall, then playing him on the fourth line isn't going to help that. And you really can't have him in San Diego. You know, he's going to have to go through waivers to come up and play for the Ducks. I don't think it's tough. I want to say I think it's going to happen for sure, but I don't know, because the Ducks do seem like they have some faith in him and that they hope he can turn things around. Nobody wants to admit they're wrong. We talked about that earlier, whether it's in a hiring of a coach or if it's signing of a player or drafting a player. You don't want to admit you're wrong, but at some point you just have to move on. And, you know, even if they get some assets, whether it's draft picks or they get another struggling player in return or they get a prospect in return, I think it's at that point where, you know, you move on from him and maybe you go get a player in free agency who you feel can help fit this new style of play that you're looking to transition to in the beginning of this next season.
Yeah, I like we said, I mean, I think he's just definitely one to watch this summer. He could be one that's on the move. And, yeah, I mean, depending on how it shakes out, I mean, the Ducks should be able to keep at least two of the three, going back to Henrique, Silfverberg, and Gibson. There may be a rub between Henrique or Silfverberg, like you said. I would think that they would lean a little bit more towards Henrique because the Ducks don't have as much depth at center. You know, I mean, obviously you have Getzlaf and Kessler, but then, you know, I don't think Vermette's coming back. He's still kind of a question mark at the exit interview. They said he was going to talk to his family. He wasn't sure what he was going to do. You know, you do have Terry down there. You have Sam Steele. You know, you have some players, you know, that can kind of come up. But I think a lot of this equation, too, as far as moving forward and deciding how they're going to do things is, though, the playing time of the fourth line, Eddie. I mean, we talked about this. If you're going to continue with this top nine, then there's no need to go get a whole lot of other players, because you're going to have a fourth line that's only going to be playing 5 to 7 minutes. But if the Ducks want to turn it around and they want to have a fourth line that's going to be playing, you know, 10 to 12, maybe 14 minutes, then maybe you do have Ritchie on that fourth line. You give him more of that time down there. Maybe you bring up a Steele or a Jones for a little bit throughout the season and let them play at that time. But I agree with you. I mean, if you're only playing that line 5-7 minutes, I don't want Ritchie on that line. I don't want any of these young guys coming up, because I think it's going to stunt their growth. I'd rather have them playing in the minors, getting more time and more experience. So that, to me, is a big decision that management's going to have to figure out, is what are you going to do with that fourth line? Are you going to continue to roll the top three and not really care about that fourth line? Or are you going to try and do something to make this team more balanced, and like you had pointed out, a 3A and a 3B, because that, to me, is really going to affect what the Ducks are going to do is in terms of going out and getting other players, or are they just going to bring up, like they do, people from the minors and just rotate people in there? I mean, you know, I'm pretty sure that they're not going to, out of Chris Kelly, JT Brown, Jason Chimera, I'm pretty sure none of them will be back, or, you know, maybe one of them, but, you know, those guys go. I mean, what does that leave you for that fourth line? I mean, I think that's part of the issue. Obviously, the money's tied up with the big three, of course, but something's got to be figured out. They want that speed game. They want a more balanced attack, Eddie. That's the part I think that's tough, and that's why I kind of lean on Ritchie getting moved out, because if they're gonna try and make this team faster and have a quality fourth line, they need to do something.
Yeah, and you know, we'll get more clarity on what they're going to do, of course, at the draft if they end up making a trade, and especially in free agency when we find out who they're bringing back and who they're letting go. In my opinion, I think Antoine Vermette, Chris Kelly, JT Brown, and Jason Chimera are probably all gone.
Yeah.
The only guy I could see of the UFAs that could come back is maybe Derek Grant. He could be a guy that they could plug in on the fourth line. They seem to like him a lot, and he was a guy that moved up and down the lineup, so he could be a guy I think could come back. But that leaves nothing else on of fourth line forwards available. Of course, Nick Ritchie would be a guy who would have to slot down there. So then you've got for fourth line forwards, you've got Nick Ritchie and Derek Grant, and that's it. So then it'll be up to what they do in free agency. There's not a lot of guys necessarily out there for fourth line forwards that are super effective and guys you can rely on. I mean, there's some top end talent available, of course, in Rick Nash and Paul Stastny and John Tavares, of course, Evander Kane, James Neal, JVR, but I just don't think the Ducks get that done, especially only having $8 million in cap space, which is obviously enough to get a deal done. But any of these guys are going to want more than 2 years for a deal, and the Ducks just don't really have the flexibility to make that happen. Of course, like I said, having to re-sign guys like Henrique, Silfverberg, and Gibson in the near future. And then some of the guys available on the bottom end for forwards, you've got like Joel Ward, Michael Grabner, Yannick Hansen. Those are guys I sarcastically brought up on Twitter as those are like Bob Murray type of guys. If he's going to add speed to this lineup, the go-to answer I feel like for him is just to go get the fastest players available, and like Michael Grabner and Yannick Hansen. Those are guys I don't think would work on the Ducks. But if that's the route he goes, where he literally just wants to add fast players to the lineup, that could be something he does. And then, there's obviously some names like Matt Calvert and Joe Colborne and Lee Stepniak. Chris Kunitz is available if he continues to come back next year. Eric Fair, who the Ducks had in San Diego for a bit and got burned by in the playoffs against San Jose. There's some fourth line guys. Yeah, there's some fourth line guys out there, but if they don't end up signing those guys, I think that will signal that they're looking for these young guys to step up. That would be my best option, I think. I would like to see Troy Terry, Sam Steele, and Max Jones get at least a couple games at the beginning of the season with the Ducks to see what they could do. We might see a couple signings in free agency where it's guys that could be either a fourth line forward or like a 13th forward. Maybe it's a couple two-way deals, something like that where we've got some cover just in case that doesn't work out. But the only way I want to see them up in the lineup is if Murray can actually get Carlisle to play this fourth line 10 to 14 minutes a night. If you're going to have Troy Terry, Max Jones, Sam Steele, if you're going to have all of them, one of them, two of them, no matter what, if you're going to have any number of them up playing on that fourth line, they need to play more minutes or it's not worth it. They need to play meaningful hockey, or you might as well just have them playing 18, 19 minutes a night down in San Diego, because that's going to be a scary team to face this year or next year when you've got all three of those guys for sure either playing in San Diego or with the Ducks in Sam Steele and Max Jones and Troy Terry. I would love to see a fourth line of those three guys just to start the season, depending on, of course, how they do in camp and whatnot. But, Sam Steele at center with Max Jones on the left and Troy Terry on the right. You don't know how they're going to produce, and it's always tough throwing three kids into it, on the same line and hoping that they can produce. But, you've got that little bit of leeway in the beginning of the season where, you can throw them into a couple games and it doesn't necessarily count as a full year against them if they end up getting sent back down. So we'll see. We'll see what they end up deciding to do. I would go with the kids if they're going to play more. That's my option. But free agency is going to be the big tell there. If the Ducks go out and get one of the bigger names I had mentioned there to play on the fourth line, then we probably don't see the kids as often. But if they go out and they don't get anybody, at least on the forward side, I think there's some changes they should do on defense, but we'll get to that in a bit. Then we might see the kids. It really all comes down to that. And it seems like, maybe not that Murray wants to necessarily play the kids, but that he definitely wants to bring some guys in on the fourth line, and he wants to see that fourth line play more.
Yeah, I tell you, I would be super excited if that was, Steele, Jones, and Terry. I mean, really? You're going to put them on the fourth line? I mean, it's kind of like when the Ducks, go back to when they won the Cup and you had Perry and Getzlaf on the fourth line. You know what I mean? And that, eventually they became, the leaders of the team. And I mean, this is what you're looking at, those three guys. I mean, we've kind of tempered expectations too, because you and I have talked about prospects and how everybody thinks all their prospects are really good and whatnot. But obviously those three, there's high expectations. So, I mean, I'm all for it because, you just go to Cap Friendly and look at the numbers. There's not a lot of money there. There just isn't. And they're going to be able to do some stuff, 8-9 million here. The cap goes up a little bit too. They'll have some things that they can do, but obviously then the next year, like we talked about with Gibson, Henrique, and Silfverberg, there's some issues. So to me, If you're not going to go get some of those senior guys that Eddie talked about, a Ward or Grabner or whatnot, I give those guys a chance and then put them on that line and see what they can do. And but only like Eddie said too, it's got to be meaningful hockey. It's got to be 10 to 13, 14, 15 minutes somewhere in there. I mean, if it's 5 to 7, that's a waste of time. They should be at San Diego and they should be doing what they got to do down there. So that's something to consider. On the defense, we can talk about that too, Eddie. I'd like to see Larson up there and see what he can do. With what's going on now, you've got Bieksa's out, Boschman's gone, most likely, like we said, unless he comes back. So you've got Lindholm, Fowler, Montour, Manson. So we spent a lot of the show on the forwards, but on the defense, it's the same kind of issue, Eddie. I mean, the Ducks can't just play 4 defensemen and bury all the minutes on those guys. They've got a same thing. These teams that are doing well in the playoffs, they're able to roll 4 forward lines, but they're able to roll 3 defensive pairings. Obviously, the third pairing isn't always the best, but the Ducks need to do something on that side too, Eddie. I mean, they got to try and figure it out because we saw when Fowler went down, the Ducks were kind of, for lack of a better term, screwed a little bit. We saw, especially on the power play, they got burned by the Sharks, who had the number 2 power play. They couldn't get the defensive stuff going. They had a lot of 2-on-1s. I know some people blame Gibson for some of the goals, which there were some, but there were a lot of odd man rushes too that did the Ducks in that series. And you could tell that they missed Fowler because you're going out there and you can't try to win all these games putting all the minutes on 3 or 4 guys.
Yeah, and defense, I think, is where you have some flexibility to use that money and make some changes. There's no real big names available other than John Carlson out of Washington, and unless the Ducks are going to use all of that $8 million to sign him, there's no way they're going to get him. And you would assume the Capitals are going to be a team that's going to want to get him back. I mean, he's a guy who should have been nominated for the Norris this year. Had 67 points in 81 games, almost played 25 minutes a night. He's been on fire for them in the playoffs. He's making $4 million at the end of this season with his contract coming up. He's due for a big raise for sure. That would be a guy you'd want to go for. I don't think the Ducks do, and there's no point, like I already said, using up all that money for a guy who's going to get probably about a 5 or 6 year deal, and you have no money to sign the guys down the road. So then you look at some of the other options there. If you're going to look at guys who could help this team the most, outside of course, John Carlson in free agency, Mike Green would be a guy that would probably help the Ducks the most. He'd be a guy that could help with their power play a lot. Probably would be slotting in as the number 1 go-to guy for offense from the blue line for the Ducks, but I don't see it happening either. I mean, interestingly enough, Detroit didn't move him at the deadline, and now looks like they're going to get nothing for him, which is insane. But he'll probably still command a decent amount of money, probably about $4 million, and he is 32, but you're going to look probably at a 2 or 3 year deal, and it doesn't make sense for the Ducks at this point to go out and get him when you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. And you've already got a top 4 that's solidified. And he's probably not going to come over if you're going to play him in a bottom pairing. And you don't want to play another $4 million guy in a bottom pairing because we've all seen how that works out in Kevin Bieksa. So I don't think that's the option. Then you got to look at some of the depth guys because there are some decent depth guys available. Anybody who's listened to me on this show when we've talked about free agents or even on Forever Mighty knows that even at the deadline, I mean, we talked about it on the deadline show as well, as Ian Cole was a guy who wanted to come over to the Ducks at the deadline. That happened early on in our deadline show where he got moved right away pretty much to the Columbus Blue Jackets, deflated that pretty quickly. He's a guy that is a UFA at the end of this season. I would still love him to come over to the Ducks and just play on the bottom pairing for Anaheim. That would be a great signing, I think, for them. Then you could maybe pull one of the kids up in Jakob Larsson or Andy Belinsky or Marcus Pettersson and play them with him, and at least you're playing them with an established NHL player, and he's a guy I really, really think that could help Anaheim. He would be my go-to guy. If you're going to put any money, you can put about $2.5, maybe $3 million on a 2-year, 3-year deal on Ian Cole. Play him on your bottom pairing. He's won a cup with Pittsburgh. People love that. Bob Murray loves that. You got that leadership right there. So I think he's a guy that could fit. As for other guys available, it drops off again. You've got maybe Brandon Manning as a guy you could go to if you're looking for more of that grit from Philadelphia. You've got Thomas Hickey and Calvin DeHaan as free agents from the New York Islanders. You could maybe bring in on that bottom pairing. But that's where I think the Ducks can allocate some of their money, because I don't necessarily want to go into the start of the season and just bank on the kids for that bottom pairing. I think it's okay to do that and maybe just acquire some cover for the fourth line and see how that works out. And then at least if that doesn't work out, you've got some guys in there. If you sign like one or two fringe players to play on the fourth line, possibly guys that still fit the system, of course, but not necessarily are worrying too much if they're the 13th forward. But on defense, I think you've got to at least bring in one guy for that bottom pairing to help out, because we know the top four is going to be fine. And, now we know that Fowler and Montour is a thing and it works. So we're going to see that if they're healthy at the beginning of next year. We're always going to see Lindholm and Manson. But, like you said, I would like to see Jakob Larsson, but I would also like to see Ian Cole or one of those other guys as part of the mix to really solidify that depth on the blue line for Anaheim going into the start of the season.
Yeah, I think that would be a win-win too. I mean, especially Ian Cole being the first choice. I agree with you. If they got someone else too, I mean, it could work as well. But I think you're right on the defense. It's harder to put pressure on two younger guys, and we saw that in the San Jose series. I mean, you couldn't do it. The Ducks couldn't get that done on that bottom three pairing, and obviously Bieksa came in there for a hot second. But I think you do got to get somebody like that, and then you can rotate in Peterson and Larson or Walensky, you know what I mean? Or if you do have to bring up another guy from San Diego. But I think you're right. If you can bring in someone for a low-cost deal and also at the same time kind of mentor those younger guys as well, because you're right. The other pairings are really set now. I mean, we weren't really sure about Fowler and Montour at first. We're like, well, they both got speed, but are they going to play defense? Montour's defense is still sometimes a little bit questionable. I mean, not necessarily his defensive play, but sometimes he jumps into the offense a little bit too much. But, I mean, overall, he's still been doing very, very well working out with Fowler. They haven't been really getting burned that badly. So it's been working. And then, of course, Lindholm and Manson's been working as well. So I think that's the thing you got to do. You can't just go with two really young guys paired together on a defensive pairing. I mean, you can, but not for a long period of time. And I think that's the issue. And I think you're right that's how they can kind of work that out. Going back to the forwards and offense, well, yeah, the fourth line, you can kind of do whatever you want. That all depends on the minutes. But for defense, I don't want to see the Ducks put so much time on those other guys, on Montour, Fowler, Lindholm, and Manson. So I think that's the way you do it. So, I mean, that's kind of the status of the team right now with all the updates. We've kind of gone through, a lot of the fan questions about everything. I guess really the biggest thing is this summer we're going to, of course, do what Eddie and I always do is we'll have some shows throughout the summer every maybe couple weeks or I don't know. We're going to have to try and figure it out. Just see how everything goes. But we'll definitely be talking about the draft and how that's going to affect the Ducks. And if you don't like what Murray does at the trade deadline, I don't blame you, but at least he does do plenty of stuff at the draft. He's always talking, working things. So, and we talked about maybe having Thomas on the show because, he does a lot of the goals and the prospects for us. So what do you think about this draft, Eddie? I mean, it's kind of interesting. You got a first round that's going to be, maybe the first 10 or 12 pretty solid, but you've been looking at this a little bit more than I have. And it kind of seems like it could be kind of a crazy draft the way it's going to work out. Like, where are the Ducks going to be at? And what do you think as far as the way the picks are going to go? And, if the Ducks don't obviously bring in stuff in free agency or trade out players that way, what do you think that they could do with, the given situation they have right now at the draft?
Yeah, the funny quote I got, and I believe it was from Eric Stevens' article. It might have been from Mike Coppin's article because I get them mixed up. But there was a quote that Murray had said that Dale Talon, the GM of the Florida Panthers, had called him and was talking about how his pick looks so much better than Murray's pick because the Panthers, I believe, are picking 15th in the draft because they just missed the playoffs, and the Ducks end up getting swept in the first round and are picking 7 or 8 picks lower at 23rd. So, it's just a little bit funny just seeing that and the little bit of banter they have there. But where the Ducks will be drafting, right now they sit 23rd. And that's where they'll stay if San Jose and Pittsburgh don't make it to the conference finals. It's a little bit interesting the way the positioning works. If San Jose and Pittsburgh or one or the other makes it to the conference finals, they automatically get dropped down to a lower pick of one of the the last 4 picks in the draft. So then the Ducks could move up to either 22nd if only one of them makes it that far. If both of them make it that far, the Ducks could jump all the way up to 21st. It's not a huge jump. There's not a lot of wiggle room there. They're either going to be picking 21, 22, or 23. So you're going to get a lot of the same guys available. I mean, if you want something to root for in the playoffs right now, maybe root for... I know you don't want the Sharks to win the Stanley Cup, and some people don't want to see the Penguins have a three-peat, but if you want the Ducks to have as high a possible draft pick they can get, you want San Jose and Pittsburgh to make the conference finals. So, looking at who is available at that point, there's a lot of defensemen and wingers throughout the first round of this draft. The top-end centers are all going to go, I think, probably in the top 15. You're looking at guys like Brady Tkachuk, Joe Veleno, Isaac Lundestrom, Rasmus Kupari. Those are really, Ryan McLeod, he might be available there, but those are really the only top end centers and guys that could project as playing center in the National Hockey League that are available. So the Ducks are probably going to have to go defense or wing. We know from the past the Ducks like to draft the best guy available. So I picked out a couple names. It doesn't mean they're going to draft them, but these are guys who are probably going to be available around there. The draft is interesting this year because there's a lot of parity pretty much outside the top 10 and the top 15, where you'll see some guys ranked at around 17 on one draft board, and then another they're ranked around 35 to 40. So there's a lot of wiggle room and a lot of guys moving up and down. The first guy I picked, because I think the Ducks should focus on forward, and if they can, focus on center. A little bit biased here because I am, as some of you know, doing an internship with the Niagara Ice Dogs this summer. So Akil Thomas from the Niagara Ice Dogs is a guy that should be available for the Ducks at 21, 22, or 23. He's a guy that can play center and the wing, and he kind of fits the style of player the Ducks have been going after, where he's a very quick player, and he's a smart player offensively. He's a guy that makes a lot of plays. He runs the offense for Niagara, and he's adept in his own end. He can make plays happen in his own end, and he can transition the puck quickly and control the play on the offensive side of the puck. So he's a guy the Ducks could go. He's a guy that probably projects as a winger in the National Hockey League, but I like the fact that he can play center as well. There's always the chance that he can possibly play center, but you never know with these smaller kids. He's 5'11". Borderline, I think, is a guy that might project as a center in the National Hockey League. And I know it's moving to a smaller game, but you still see, generally, the guys who play center at an elite level are at least 6 foot, 6'1", 6'2", right? I think you need to be a little bit of a bigger guy to compete in the National Hockey League at center. It doesn't mean he can't do it, but he's a guy the Ducks could go for. Another one that I was looking at, as I already mentioned, was Rasmus Kupari. If he's available, he's a guy the Ducks should definitely get. Pretty much every draft board I've looked at has him going at least around the 20th pick. So if he fell farther enough for the Ducks, he's a guy I think they have to go in. Probably that would fall right under Murray's draft the best player available if he was there. He's a guy that plays center in the Finnish league, a guy that pretty much only plays center. I think that's the best option for the Ducks if he's there. The third option I had was a guy that's kind of all over the place, and there's been a lot of people, including Corey Prodman, who have been very high on this kid. His name's Dominik Bach. He's a German national, and he plays with the Växjö Lakers in the Swedish Elite League. He's been playing with one of the best players outside the NHL this year, in Elias Peterson, who's a prospect for the Vancouver Canucks, and he's done great. And he's a guy that can play on either side, on the left or right, and he looks like one of those guys. You always look for that prospect every year who started off where you really didn't hear much about him. Then he kind of projected in the third round. Then he started getting projected in the second round. And then you started seeing him maybe get projected late first round. And some people have him as high as 15. Some people have him close to the top 10. You kind of look for those guys because they've just gotten better and better all season. And those are the types of guys you look to maybe steal late in the first round. So if he's available, that'd be a guy I'd like to see the Ducks get. They do need to stock up a bit on the wing, and it's always nice to see a guy who can play on the left or the right. And the last one for me, if the Ducks want to go defense, I think you would agree with me on this. If you were to look at what they're missing on their blue line right now, it's a guy with just raw offensive talent. A power play quarterback, a guy, we kind of expected Brandon Montour to be that type of guy, but he's molded more in a two-way guy. We don't really have that guy who can get 50 points, 50, 60 points on the blue line consistently and be a threat on the power play. Now, this is probably the biggest enigma at the draft. Ryan Merkley out of the Guelph Storm in the OHL. He's a guy that if you're just going off his offensive talent, would probably be a lock for the top 10 pick. Some people early on had him in the top 5 just because of his offensive ability. I mean, he's probably the guy out of the defensemen available who has the highest offensive upside, and he probably has the best hockey sense out of most of the defensemen available. But his defensive side of the game lacks, and that's very concerning. In when you're looking at the fact that he really doesn't back check that hard in the OHL. He creates a lot of turnovers. When you're looking at that in junior, that doesn't bode well for what he could do in the National Hockey League. You can always figure out the defensive side of the game, especially when a guy matures. He's a little bit smaller at 5'11", so it's tough to think. I always look at a guy that's come out that had a lot of hype around his offensive ability, and Ryan Murphy, who Carolina drafted him. And he just didn't turn out, and he really has struggled to make it to the National Hockey League. So this is a high-risk, high-reward draft for the Ducks. But if they're looking to go defense, I think the Ducks have the ability to try and risk swinging for the home run, and then maybe it doesn't turn out. I feel like this is the guy you go for. He does have some off-ice issues as well, but those are things that can be fixed with maturity and just get it. Once he gets drafted, just getting the right guys in front of him. I mean, who better to stick in front of a kid who's having some issues defensively, having some issues off the ice than Scotty Niedermayer, right? I mean,
yeah,
I feel like that would be the best for him. If he's a guy, again, like I said, that at one point was projected to go top 5, and reminds me a bit of Maxime Comtois last year, where he was originally projected to go middle of the first round and slipped to the second round. And now look at the season he's had this year. And he's really shown that he deserved to go in the first round, and the Ducks essentially stole him in the middle of the second round. So this is a guy the Ducks could look to go for if they're going to go on defense, because he's really that piece they're missing on their blue line of a guy who has some pure offensive talent.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, that's what the defense needs, is someone like that. The Ducks really haven't had like a Brent Burns type person or a Subban type person that can get in there and really help out on the offensive part of the special teams, or just even 5-on-5 situations. So I agree with you. I mean, there's something to be said for that. If the Ducks can go out and Murray does that kind of stuff at the at the draft, not the trade deadline. He goes in the draft there, and he'll pick up some sleepers like that, like you talked about. Sometimes he gets these guys that late first round pick or early second or third round pick, and that are guys that turn out. So that's something to keep in mind. We're going to have a more detailed show, obviously, and as it gets closer to that time, see if anything else changes in the meantime. See who's going to replace Trent Yanni. We don't know about that yet. That should be coming out. And I guess really to wrap up the show, the big positive thing, Eddie, is at least the Ducks are going to be healthy going into the next season. Yeah. You still have the same coach, you have the same GM. If you want either one of them to be gone, that's pretty much not going to happen. So that's the bad part. But you've got this team that's going to be healthy. Eves is coming back. Still a good team. I think a lot of what Eddie and I talked about on this show is trying to fine tune the bottom parts of the team, the fourth line and the third line on defense. And I really think, it's kind of the theme of the show is how the Ducks are going to do. If they're going to improve this speed game and they want to play better overall, offense and defensively, they need a complete team, and they're going to have to figure that out. The big question is just going to be the money, Eddie. And they're going to have to go from there. I mean, like we said, maybe bring up some of the kids or get a couple additions in free agency. We'll have a show talking about that too, obviously, because, the summer is pretty dead. So with the draft and free agency, those will be a couple of the shows that we'll have coming up. But I still have faith in this team, Eddie. I still think they can do fine. I don't think the question's the regular season. I mean, we've seen this team first place, 4 or 5 seasons in a row. Second place, I mean, you've seen them in the top of the Pacific. I'm never really worried about the Ducks. I just think that they kind of play with everybody's emotions because they have the slow starts in October, November, December. They turn it on the second half, and then we get disappointed come April, May. So I think if they can maybe do some of those depth adjustments, then maybe we won't be disappointed come April and May in the future seasons.
Yeah, I think this team, and I already mentioned in the show that on paper they're still a good team. Even if they go in with what they have right now, they're still a good team. The big thing I'm looking for is, based off Murray's comments, how they're going to change this style. That's going to be the thing I'm looking for out of the gate, game 1 of the season, and even in preseason, if we can see some of it there, where is this team going to look any different? And if they do look different, is it going to work or is it going to backfire? Because they have the talent on the ice to still compete for a playoff spot and do well and get into the playoffs, but they were exposed this year for being a slower team and playing an out-of-date style. And I honestly don't see how that changes. I'm still optimistic, despite the fact I don't believe it changes, that the Ducks can do well. But, competing for a cup, I just don't think you can do it playing the style they currently play. They can still upset a couple teams just because of raw skill. They're going to need some things to go their way, and they're going to need to figure out offense and specifically the power play as well, because they were awful again this year. It's hard to win meaningful games when your goal scoring plus your power play are in the bottom third of the league. I mean, there's not much you can do. I mean, this is a team who should be scoring goals on a regular basis when you've got guys like Rickard Rakell, Corey Perry, Ryan Getzlaf, Ryan Kessler, Adam Henrique. You've got these guys in the lineup. You should be scoring more goals than they have. So that's the big question mark for me, is can Carlisle change? And if he doesn't, how quick is he out the door if the Ducks are struggling?
And with that, I mean, we're going to wrap up the show. Those are all the key issues. We kind of broke down the season and, where we're going to go from here. Like I said, we'll have a couple shows coming up. If you like what we've been doing, and also we're going to be working on the website, doing some other stuff to kind of improve in the off season and whatnot. So stay tuned for that. But if you want to help us out, we have a website called patreon.com. patreon.com/DucksNPucks. You can donate on there, get a shout out on the show, or give away some items, either towels, stickers, t-shirts, whatnot. So look for that, and we'll see you probably in a couple weeks. Let's go Ducks.